Good afternoon, teacher. We are the discussion group letter G, and we start with this topic. What is psycholinguistics study? Next, please. The psycholinguistic study gives us knowledge uh, of the underlying process of language and the human mind, and how we come about the store language information and understand each other in communication. Uh, there, I may be, there may be difference in the reasons to carry out this type of study coming from psychological or a linguistic perspective, but research here generally important for the ways to improve quality for human experiences of language or communication. For example, the very teaching methods can often be developed, and once the fundamental reasons behind the difficulties and understood, methods of therapy can be considered for individuals with impaired language, much like to improve and develop and helps to develop and learn all our brain of all people.
Agree with your point of view of how psycholinguistic could help us we as a teacher. I think that is a really good tool to improve education. But in our educational system, it is not really applied. You know what? I think that this field, psycholinguistic, is the key important in develop of learning any language. We teachers must know how the language learning takes place in people's brain and mind. Besides, there are some factors that also influence the learning of in this language process. I have a question to you. Ivan, do you think that there are more external factors that influence the language process and why?
Yes, because the person is developing in society and is acquiring a new language and a new words, such as how to talk about how we express ourselves, as well as a meaning to develop our brain and continue to adapt in the society and the world.
Well, let's start with Jean case. This is one of a clear example of how psycholinguistic can help us in understand how our brain work and of course what are the causes to stop to their work. Jean is the name that scientific gave to a girl who was victim of several social illusions. This is really important because this girl was really affected by this abuse from their parents and also from their brother. Let's start about the story about this girl. He was found in her house on November 4th of 1970. It is one of the most important cases of wild children presented in United States. Let's start with a little bit about her childhood. It's important for to know the complete and complex story about her to understand and know a bit about the background about her family. Well, her parents were Clark Gray Willie and Dorothy, and her brother was John. During her early childhood, Jenny's mother had a severe head injury in an accident, giving her neurological damage that caused degenerative vision problems. This point is really important here because her mother was disabled to take care of her. On another hand, Jenny's father mostly grew up in orphanage in American Pacific West Surf So for this, all of this reason, and adding that he didn't have a good childhood because he hated her adoptive father that most of the time beat him. So he has a really great anger with all the people, and he reflected it into her daughter, his daughter, and of course, most of the time with her wife. Well, when the little Jeannie started to talk, her father noticed that he had some problems. And of course, according to the doctor in that time in the hospital where he went, they detected that he has a learning problem. So, first, Genie is the term according to the psychology and of course the linguistic that train them in all this process, and it comes from the idea to a magic spirit. We also heard about it maybe in movies or maybe in some novels, that it is associated with the idea to waiting to come out. And this is a real example and clear example of how was Jeannie's life. Well, when she was approximately maybe 20 months old, her father began keeping her in locker room. During this period of time, he almost always strapped her into a child's toilet. It's because her father and her mother didn't have time to take care, and of course, they didn't want to take care from her to like her brother. So in this time, with her arms and legs completely immobilized, first of all, anyone from interacted with her. She didn't have a direct interaction with the environment, with the world, and of course, a direct interaction with language communication. It caused, and it is a clear result of how he never developed a complete language process. So, from this interacted with anymore, provided with almost stimulation of any kind, he left severely dark alumni. The extent of her isolation was provoked and prevent her that he was exposed to any significant amount of speech. He didn't don't acquire language during her primary childhood as a result. It's important to know that he was found when he was 13 years. So her lockdown was starting when she was 20 months, and he was found with police and some linguistic and psychology when she was 13 years. So it was almost 12 years that he didn't have any communication with the world or with her parents around her. Next, please. Well, here we have a real video that shows us who was Ginny in that time, of course. As we can see in the video and pictures, the little girl can walk completely well. So it's because Janie's father had an extremely low tolerance for noise. So in this point of refusing and hard working, he didn't hear anything, even though television or radio in house. So it is why Jeannie never developed communication of motor movement during this important stage of her childhood. As we can see, the little Jenny was really different than the another kids, because most of the time, even though he didn't speak, or communicate with her father, with her mother, her daughter. Her father all the time imitate a dog. So he really adopted this aggressive behavior and expressed it all the time. Next, please. So here we have the studies. The study is, well, first of all, it was to psychology and linguistic view. It was a really good case of study, but as we already know, it wouldn't be unethical to carry out this type of study because it involves a human being. In this case, a little child. So one of the important comments that most of the psychology did in that time, and I really take up, is because he expressed that even though the human being have this innate origin capacity to communicate, as Chomsky said in his theory about the nature of communication and acquisition of language, it's really important that children need to cross up in all these stages in order to have a whole incomplete language process learning. That's it all.
Other case similar to Jeannie's was Anna's case. Anna was a federal child from Pennsylvania. Anna obviously is a nickname given by some psychologists to a girl who raised in isolation. But fortunately, she was rescued on February 6, 1938 by Emma Smith. Let's talk about her childhood. She was an illegitimate girl. She was born in a nurse private home because her mother and grandfather didn't want to talk about it. After 2 or 3 weeks from her birth, many people considered to adopt her until they discovered she had some health problems. So when she was 2 months of age, she was sent to a private foster home until her family couldn't pay. So she returned to her home when her mother, isolated her from the world. When psychologists found her, first they go to a children's home, and she was treated with an expressionless face, and she didn't talk. So many people think that she was deaf or blind, but it wasn't true because after 9 months, she was in a foster home with unremitting attention. She can improve her cognitive and motor skills. After 2 years, she was in a home for retired children when she developed a poor speech and when she died with leptosis, that is a blood illness. Some effects of isolation is social and emotional effects that we have, like cognitive abilities and the motor skills damage. Also, we have the brain damage that can affect to color sensitive and imagination. Another thing is the damage to senses when she was a little baby, so it caused a poor speech from her, and Anna receives some treatment that helps her to increase muscle tone or her vocabulary and communication, but it wasn't enough.
Well, let's start the discussion about this. Two clear examples and case studies of how psycholinguistics can help us to analyze it, and of course, the brain's work. Well, I think that these two cases and genes cases are best done as a study of language acquisition in the child, in which it could be delayed by some linguistic development of a study on a deaf child. I think that even as we already know, the human beings are social, so we need to interact frequently with our environment. And we, as we know, we have this ability, natural ability to acquire a language. Most of the time, if it's a mother language. But Jeannie and N case demonstrate us that it's really necessary that in the early childhood, the language stimulation in the left and right hemisphere impulse and start to the part that the brain works according to the language process. I think that Ginny and Anne never fulfilled acquired grammar on a good way to communicate something clear and whole, but I think that it provides evidence of how working and how important are the stage proposed by Jean Piaget. The first stage is show us a clear example of how must be the developed process of a child during they are babies to they are teenagers or adults.
That's true, but unfortunately, I couldn't agree with you in some part because it isn't a study. They are in studies, and because a study can be observational, but it is not observational. It's not a study that you can that people want and show a correlation and relation basing on retrospective studies or maybe on data that we have. There are some experiments that people choose to do, and is only shown the unethical thing, the unethical sense that humans can have with little children. And also, it's a little bit different between Ginny and Anna, and it is that genies have a better speech development, while Anna couldn't develop the spec age of the spec stage according to her age.
I think that the cases of Jenny and Anne were healthy children, but the captivity have deprived them of the process essential to the normal brain develop. For example, socialization. That is the introduction of the individual into a group to the life. Think for a few moments what would have happened if in your first years of life no one had spoken to or touched or even being around you. It was not a thing of captivity. People who are kidnapped and spend years locked up without having contact with anyone do appear with these problems like Jenny and present.
These two cases are very important because it shows us that extreme isolation, negative influence on mental development, the brain doesn't develop well and the language is lost, which cannot be fully recovered, which are part of the ability to walk, run, play, dress, fit into a social situation as well as speak. This is why it's impossible to any child to learn to speak, think, and act a normal person after a long period of time. That reason is important the social interaction since the childhood. Finally, we have the strobe effect. This test was first reported by John Raleigh Strobe in 1935. This is about looks at how brain process words. We process these letters so fast that we have a hard time saying the color instead of the word. To observe how our brain processes different things at various speed, Strobe used 3 types of experiments. The first one is use the names of the colors, that blue, green, etc., in a black ink. The second is the names of the colors in ink of different colors. And the third one is use simple colored squares. Next, please. The findings of the test is to measure the brain's ability to process language, the way it focuses on one aspect of something while ignoring the rest, and finally, the speed at which the brain recognizes words. The test is used for to highlight psychological or mental disorders such as brain damage, dementia, and for give more complete conclusions about psychologistics abilities of the brain. Also, according to Strobe, identify the color in the place of the word is too difficult since our brain automatically associates that word with its meaning. And I think this effect analyzes and reveals how the brain processes information, as well as can also be used to measure a personal ability, selective attention skills, and processing speed. Thank you.
Well, according to this theme, I think that this strobe is more closely to anyone that was confused. As we can note and see in this experiment, it suggests that there is a line in the brain's ability to recognize a color of the world. Even though we already know that the color is a cultural issue, rather than it recognize the color is something really automatic, but is based on the idea that word processing, not just the color. I think that is more that the word processing and how the brain separates the idea of color and word, and how time it could be recognized, separating these two parts. I think that in this part, the brain works the left hemisphere and of course the right hemisphere. This process is significantly faster than the color processing. In this condition, where there is a complete regarding words and colors that is reflecting in this strobe test, it could be a really kind of difficulty. I mean, and when you have maybe the word yellow, but this word is in red, it's kind of difficult. But you will recognize faster than the word maybe could be the color. I think that it depends on the type of learning that you have. If you are visual, maybe you can recognize faster the color than the word. Even though these issues, I think that we have a selective attention. It suggests that the color recognition as opposed to regarding the word. It requires more attention, and in some cases people can lose her attention, or maybe it is requires to maybe a learning process problem.
Well, I am agree with you. The little confusing thing that we have when we listen or when we see a word and the color that are combined can be related with another process called the tip of the tongue, that is following to retrieve a word from our memory that we combine with a feeling or we retrieve with a memory. And in this case, it can be a factor from people to recognize first the color or the letter. Besides the codifying process, it's relevant because humans' brain tend to recognize first the lexicon besides the color, so many people can record to the first encoding process a sense, or maybe others can refer that to a feeling or to a memory.
Your comment remembered me a really normal case and maybe something that we do every time in our life is about the game that the teacher saying shoulders and she's touching maybe her hands. So it could be that the recognizing and how the brain processes it could be confused to the brain to present two inputs in the same time. I think that it is the case of this stroke effect and how it could be influence the automatic process to recognize the worlds, they codify the worlds, and of course the different factors, in this case colors, that could be
And also, our attention is selective with this effect. This means that we control it according to interest us. So we can voluntarily pay more attention to some things that others are giving. For the example, the color of the letters of the word. But sometimes we suffer interference, such as the stroke effect, because it's important the attention in your brain, and we can develop the different capacities.
well, guys, as a reflecting point and conclusion, I think that this field, psycholinguistic, and its importance, it's really hard in our profession. We as a future teacher, it could be the key and important to develop a good teaching and learning process, of course, in a foreign language. As we know, our educational system don't apply completely this field and these tools that offer us, but we know now that we as a teacher must know how the language learning takes place in people's minds and brains, and how the brains can control it, and how we as a teachers can offer into our students opportunities to develop all these things during the mental process, of course, while they are enjoying it. We don't forget it most of the time, even though we're teaching something. We need to remember that children and guys and students need to enjoy it. Even though we know with this experiment how the language, even though it could be acquired, need to cross up to some important stages in order to develop in a correct way.
Thank you for your attention, and that's all.